Welcome back to Curious for Christ. Today's episode is unlike any other topic we've talked about. It's about our own mortality. We don't like to talk about death. In our culture, we avoid it, we cover it up, we distract ourselves with youth, beauty, and success. Maybe you're young and this topic feels distant or even irrelevant, but the Bible reminds us in Ecclesiastes 7 verse 2, "It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart." There is wisdom in reflecting on our own mortality. In fact, we were created to live forever with God. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 26 calls death our greatest enemy. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And yet, through Christ, God transformed that very enemy into the doorway to life. 2 Timothy 1 verse 10 says, "Our Savior, Christ Jesus, has destroyed death and has brought life and immortality to light through the gospel." Let me share a personal story. I once worked with Ryan Serhant, the celebrity real estate broker you may know from $1 Million Listing, one of New York's top brokers. A client of mine needed to sell a condo on the Upper East Side, and through Ryan and his team, we got it done. Sometime later, I saw a video of him on social media reading a question about death. He gave a little grin and said, "I will never die." And it stuck with me because that response, though confident and even inspiring on the surface, reflects a philosophy that simply doesn't leave room for mortality, let alone for spiritual meaning in it. But what if that's exactly where we begin to see clearly? As Jesus said in Luke 9 verse 24, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." Ryan Holiday, another Ryan, #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Obstacle is the Way, writes that oftentimes the obstacle is the way, as the title suggests. In other words, what seems to stand in our way, such as aging, for instance, or death as the ultimate obstacle, or our own mortality, might actually be the path forward. So let's take a closer look at what these realities can reveal to us about God, life, purpose, and eternity with today's conversation. Because that's exactly what Gordon Ferguson's story illustrates so beautifully. His experience with cancer and facing the brink of eternity became a lens through which he could see more clearly God, himself, and his true purpose. So today I'm honored to welcome once again my friend and teacher, Gordon Ferguson. His voice of wisdom and vulnerability touched so many hearts in our most listened to episode to date, episode 26, which is about struggling to trust God and gender roles, where we discuss his most sold book, God and Women, How Did I Miss So Much? But today, we're going to explore something different. We're going to talk about Gordon's least sold book, which is titled My Roller Coaster Ride with God and Cancer, then Sitting with Him on the Brink of Eternity. A little bit about Gordon. He's a graduate of Northwestern State University and the Harding School of Theology with more than 50 years of ministry experience. He has served as an evangelist, elder, and teacher, authored 21 books, and produced numerous teaching series in audio and video. Gordon and his wife, Teresa, live in McKinney, Texas. And for more information about his work, you can visit his website at www.gordonferguson.org. And now, without further ado, let's step into this powerful conversation. Welcome to Curious for Christ. Do you ever find yourself lying awake at night wondering about God's plan for your life? Maybe you wake up with big dreams but feel unsure where to start or what your next step should be. If you're curious about exploring your faith and finding purpose, then you've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Alexandra. I too felt lost, unsure of the direction my life was taking. I yearned to understand my purpose and have someone guide me. But I kept telling myself I was too busy, the timing wasn't right, and my lack of clarity prevented me from being consistent until I found Christ. He brought peace into my life and revealed the way to find purpose by anchoring myself in Him. In this podcast, we'll journey together, exploring the Bible to gain a deeper understanding of Him and cultivate your own personal relationship with Christ. So open up your Bible, put in those earbuds, and listen up, because God is speaking to you. He is making everything new, and you don't want to miss it. Let's get started. Good morning, Gordon, and thank you again for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's
Of
always
course.
good to see you and be with you.
And likewise. And so, just for the records, our listeners enjoyed so much our previous conversation about God and women. It's the top episode of my entire podcast. And so, I'm excited about today's conversation. And we're going to be talking about another book and a really different topic, always
Right.
about God, but very different
Right.
nonetheless. And for those who haven't read your book yet, can you just start by giving us a little context? What inspired you to write God and Cancer, my roller coaster ride with Him on the brink of eternity?
Well, having cancer. And so the timing of this is very interesting. I was diagnosed January the 5th, 2022. So 3 years ago plus some. And so you go through all these tests, they're trying to see if it's metastasized and spread and all of that. And so it started off actually pretty good. I wasn't that concerned, or I wasn't hit as much emotionally as I thought I might be. Most people are so fearful of hearing the big C word.
Yeah.
And yet the stats say that half of us are going to get cancer, and that's going to be an increasing statistic. And yet at the same time, they're discovering ways to treat it much better. And so I have lists of people that I pray for who have cancer. The large majority are dealing with it and are not terminal. And so I think the improvements have been pretty amazing. And so the big C word should not be quite as scary to us as it has been in the past. So when I was diagnosed, I was 79 years old. I'm 82 now, but I was 79 at the time. And so my comment to my surgeon was, we all have a shelf life, and I'm already 79. And her comment was, that's true, but you're in very good health otherwise. And so we need to get this treated. And she was fairly hopeful that it could be put in remission. And so we went from there. That night after I heard the diagnosis, I slept like a baby. My problem wasn't emotionally being that disturbed about it. But then the disturbance came from a friend of mine insisting, he had cancer and been treated successfully, and he insisted that I move to another treatment center. And so that was kind of hard to deal with because I was already fairly well set with the system I was in, but I had to change. And so that was the bigger item. And so in the early part of the book, I tell all about that switch, and it has some very funny parts to it. Looking back on it, it actually is quite hilarious, but I ran into so many things that were, quote, coincidental, and I don't believe in coincidences. In fact, I wrote an article one time on my website called I Have Lost My Faith, and then I put in parentheses, in coincidences, because I believe that God's always at work. And he works in mysterious ways, and he always seems to enjoy putting me in some weird situations. I think God has a sense of humor, and he likes to trick me and play tricks on me, and we have an interesting relationship. So the real challenge for me at first was just doing the switch. I'm glad I did. I went to a better system. One of the top cancer treatment centers in the Dallas area is University of Texas Southwestern. And so I went to that treatment center. I got a wonderful radiologist, a fairly young Chinese woman raised in Boston, went to an Ivy League undergraduate school, trained at Harvard Medical School. So she was a great oncologist. And so God set me up with all of that. And I tell all about the details leading to that, which are off the chart amazing to me looking back.
Mm.
And so one of the points in the first maybe third of the book, as I describe all of this, is describing that you see God in different ways. And I felt like I saw him in many ways. And it's important to see him. I believe that God can be seen and wants to be seen. And so there are lessons like that stand out, I think, in the early part. But I went, after I finally got everything lined up for the treatment, I started chemotherapy, 6 big pills every day, 3 in the morning, 3 at night, and then radiation 5 days a week. And so that was the start of it. And it was rather amazing. I had no side effects for 3 weeks. I did get a blister on my foot, and they said that was normal with the chemo. But other than that, I was still out doing my 3 to 5 mile walks every day or nearly every day and feeling fine, feeling no side effects at all. And then on Easter Sunday, which that year was yesterday's date, the 17th, on that day, we went to church, we came home, had my son and his family over for lunch, and then I think we were watching the Masters golf match, and all of a sudden, my body exploded. All the fluid in my body came out from every place it could come out.
Wow.
And it was a shock, and it just depleted me of all fluids in my body. I went to the doctor on maybe Tuesday after just being totally out of it since Sunday. And so she put me on an IV to get some fluids back in my body. I went back home and it still was the same thing. Nothing slowed down. And so I was totally out of it, just in bed, sleeping a lot of the time, just really almost out of my senses. Went back to the same nurse practitioner on Friday, and she said she finally asked the right question. We males have a hard time going to hospitals or going to doctors even, at least a lot of us do. And so she finally asked the right question. She said, if you go home, do you think you will be okay? And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, no, if I go home, I think I will die. And she said, that's what the chemotherapy doctor and I both think, so go check yourself in to the hospital. And that led to a 23-day stay in the hospital. And during much of that time, that's why I call the title or put in the title On the Brink of Eternity, because I didn't know if I'd live or die. My family didn't know if I would live or die. I looked pretty dead at one point. But anyway, it was through that period of time that I had so many insights and so many conversations with God, and so much happened. I wouldn't take anything for the experience spiritually. Now, physically, that was a different matter. It was a very tough time, and there were a lot of complications that led to 23 days. But at any rate, spiritually, it was very good for me.
I love how you share that you saw God and everything. And I think that's really crucial to handle the ups and downs of life or the uncertainty, is to always seek his face.
Right.
And then the insight that you gain when you were physically at your lowest is incredible. One of the themes that really stood out is living with eternity in mind. And that's something that probably during those 23 days you gained a different perspective on. What did that perspective shape the way you navigated your cancer diagnosis and treatment? And then after being healed, you are cancer free as of 3 years ago. So how does that shape the way you live your life today?
I think it shapes it more now than ever to realize that we are all terminal. We all have a shelf life. The Bible talks about living to be 70, by reason of strength, 80. That's Psalm 90, the oldest psalm in the Bible. And from that, I've always known that I will hopefully get old and will die. That's inevitable. And so even from a young childhood, people would tell me, the old guys would say, son, it's going to go by a lot faster than you think. And I actually believed them because they're all saying the same thing. And the Bible says over and over that life is like a shadow and it goes by so quickly, but it goes by a lot more quickly than you think it will. And so when I got to the point that I was facing death and thinking I might well die, of course, then you evaluate everything and you think, what would I have done differently? What would I advise other people to do, etc. But I live every day, my wife and I both, with the concept of we have today. That's all
Mm-hmm.
anyone has.
Yeah.
No one's guaranteed life tomorrow, but we have it today. And
Mm-hmm.
so we try to live each day to the full with
Mm-hmm.
God in mind and looking for God's purposes in our life, praying that He will open the right doors, shut the wrong doors, just really basically lead us
Yeah.
by His Spirit into spending time in a way that would be useful to Him and to other
Mm-hmm.
people.
And the assurance that He will lead us home and we are being carried. I really love that. And then also the wisdom that comes from numbering our days so that we make the best of it today. What is certain is what we have today, and how can we make the best of it? It is definitely wise to do that. I wanted to talk about another subject, another theme that you mentioned in the book. It's the role of servanthood. It's another powerful theme. How did that call to serve remain steady or even deepen while you were going through such a personal battle?
Servanthood is a huge issue. I have been a leader in churches for
Yeah.
over half century, and I have written 2 books, co-authored one and wrote another on my own about church leadership, because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 20 that the greatest of all is the servant of all. And He
Mhm.
said that in the midst of dealing with apostles who were vying for position, who gets to sit on the left and who gets to sit on the right. And so they had a very worldly view of leadership, as most do. And yet Jesus said the real leader is the one who is a servant of all. And so I know that is true. But what actually led to the theme, I think, developing the way it did with me in the hospital, is that I was raised in a very legalistic church setting. I was trained in a fairly legalistic ministry setting. And so I've always struggled with my view of God. There are certain parts of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, that seem to present God as being pretty harsh and pretty judgmental. And so I'm one of these with what I call an accused type conscience, and I can
Mhm.
feel guilty when I shouldn't. There are other
Mhm.
people that don't feel guilty when they should, but that's another type of personality. But
Yeah.
at any rate, I've struggled a lot with my view of God and worked on it much of my life. And it came from overcoming my past. It came from trying to overcome some of the early experiences with my father, who was very harsh when I was
Mhm.
young. All of that improved with time. He improved tremendously with time. And by the time he died, he and I had a very close emotional
Mhm.
relationship. But I had a lot to overcome. And for some reason, in one of those nights when I couldn't sleep or I was in and out of sleep and whatever else that was going on, I don't know, hallucinations or whatever, but there was a saying that a friend of mine made many years ago. I had a friend, we both taught in similar ministry training schools, and he and I were good friends, and he's written a lot of books, very good books, everything from commentaries and deep subject stuff down to devotional books that are extremely good. His name is Jim McGuigan. I'm not sure if Jim's still alive or not. He's somewhat older than me, not a lot. But years ago, Jim said this. He said, God did not become a servant when He became a human in the person of Jesus. God became a servant. God
Became
became a
human.
man. He became a human because He was a servant. That's who God is, a servant. And I thought about Matthew 20. The greatest leader will always be the one that's a servant or slave of all. And so,
Mhm.
if the greatest is the greatest servant, it has to be God, because God is the greatest
Mhm.
being conceivable and beyond conception. And
Mhm.
so, it hit me in the middle of the night that God is a servant. And so I started thinking, okay, the Bible says that God is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, but He's also the servant of servants. And so then I began to see God in a much different light and a better light. And even the things that I couldn't understand or didn't like in the Bible about God, I said to myself, you've got to figure out a better way of looking at that. There's something you're missing here because God is at heart the greatest servant he could possibly be. And then I look at my own life. I'm 82, my wife is 81. We recently celebrated 60 years of marriage.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But God has blessed us so much. He has served us so much.
Yeah.
That should have been obvious to me that he's a servant. And yet other people aren't blessed as much as we are, and they have to find ways to evaluate their experiences and the Bible in light of the fact that God is the greatest servant possible.
Yeah. Just the way that he guides us to him. Who are we that he would walk with us through all of it? That is beautiful. And then you bring also a unique perspective on salvation at some point, especially in relationship to servanthood and grace. Can you unpack that a bit for our listeners, especially that notion of grace versus work? How do you see grace and obedience working together? What are your conclusions on that?
To begin with, God is not just after our obedience. Obedience has a purpose, and that is to help us develop into who we are and to be like him. And so with little children, you tell them exactly what to do, otherwise they run off into the street. But in time, what you are training them to do is become mature adults that are good people and that do good things. But it's not that you focus on the doing of it, it's that you focus on the heart changing, so that is who you become. And so I look at God's grace as a motivation to help me become more like him. And so gratitude is huge. If you look in Romans 1, where he describes the Gentile world who had really gone off track, he begins by talking about they lost their gratitude. And I have helped people that dealt with physical or chemical recovery groups. I've worked with guys that taught those groups, and all of them have said the same thing. You can tell when an addict is going to get back on their drug of choice by when they cease to be thankful. When they lose their gratitude, then they're wide open to Satan getting them right back where they were before. So gratitude just has so much to do with our response to God, and to realize that he's not just some master cracking a whip and saying, do this or do that. That's not his purpose. His purpose is to help our hearts change so that our whole life is not so much about what we do, but who we are. And who we are is what the actions grow out of. They become natural or much more natural to us because that's who we are. So we do it.
Yeah.
And on the whole servanthood thing, as I point out in the book, I happen to live with a woman who has a gift of servanthood that I have never seen surpassed, maybe equaled, but never surpassed. And she just serves. It's natural. She can't help it. She just does it. It's who she is. And so I try to imitate her because she's a lot better at it than I am.
That's great. Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you. And it's true, gratitude keeps us open to being in touch with God's grace. And once we lose that, then we go with our own ways. We go back to what we want instead of being in touch with what God is doing and how he works in our lives. So thank you. So you've said also that we often avoid talking about cancer and death, and it's not an easy topic. It's not a topic that we like to talk about in today's society. We actually go at lengths to really avoid it. We want to look good and young and feel young and avoid that topic at all costs. Why do you think that is, beyond the obvious of vanity or whatever that reason may be? And how can we as believers find courage to face those realities with honesty, with faith, with humility, perhaps also?
Disease and suffering is difficult.
Yeah.
No one would volunteer it. In fact, one of the things that I used to pray in the hospital is, God, I'm not sure which side I will wake up on, eternity or back in the hospital here, because I felt like I was 50-50 on whether I lived or died. But I said, Lord, I want to live, especially for the sake of my family. On the other hand, if I get through this, the scary part is I'll have to do something like this again in order to die, because we're all going to die. So I had to count that cost and realize that. But I think the aging part is hard. I've always had trouble with aging all of my life. My 40th birthday, I still remember, that was like, wow, that's old. I did pretty good with 50 and 60, oddly enough, because I was still in really good health and traveling all over the world and speaking and teaching and writing books and all of that. 70, on the other hand, that was a hard one. 80 wasn't as hard, because I thought, okay, it talks in Psalm 90 about living to be 70 and by reason of strength 80. And so I started making a joke that from this point forward, I'm playing on house money. Not that I always haven't been. It's always been God's blessing of life. But at any rate, I did okay on that birthday. But aging's been hard. But on the other hand, death is the most scary thought that most of us have. And there is a reason for that. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that death is the last enemy. It is an enemy. And you can look at when people in the Bible died, like Stephen or Jesus, which we're celebrating that time of the year now. But you look at that, or John the Baptist. If you watch the series The Chosen, which I highly recommend, John the Baptist, when he's beheaded, they don't show the actual beheading, but he dies. And that led to grief among disciples, among Christians. So there's always going to be a grief connected with death for those of us that are left. But if we're viewing it correctly, then those who die, if they're right with God, then they're much better off. And so Paul, who had actually seen the other side, he said he didn't know if he was in the body or out of it, but he was caught up to the third heaven and into paradise and saw things he couldn't repeat. And I think that's 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so in Philippians 1, he says it's far better to die and be with Christ. But he said, for your sake, I'd rather stay so that I can serve and help you. So we have to get past the fears and to realize that if we're right with God, to die is gain, as Paul said. And it takes away a lot of the fear. But the thing that's shocking to me, you mentioned the podcast that we did before was very well received, and very grateful and glad to hear that. So the book that I wrote on the Bible and women has sold very well. It's an Amazon book, available on Amazon, and it is still being sold after all of this time. And yet, on the other hand, the next book that I wrote was the one on cancer, and it's out of 21 books that I've written, 2 of which were co-authored, but 21 books. This book on cancer has sold the least of any book I've ever written by far. People just don't want to talk about it. And yet, those that have cancer, we all know we have friends or relatives with cancer, every last one of us. We may have it, we may have had it, but it's so prevalent that I wanted to talk with people that had dealt with cancer, so I'd know what to expect. Tell me what the radiation treatment was like. Tell me this. Tell me how you felt. Because our emotions, you have 2 levels of emotion. One is the conscious and one is the subconscious. consciously, most of the time, I just lived life when I was diagnosed and being treated. It didn't seem to interrupt my daily life much, and I didn't think about it that much. But every now and then something would trigger it, and I would have a lot of emotion well up. And so we kind of live on two levels emotionally, but we need to recognize that, and we need to be able to talk with people that have dealt with it or read books. The people that I've talked to that read the book and they've had cancer, they said it was very helpful just to know that all of the emotional up and down and weirdness stuff that's happening is not abnormal. That's just the human psyche and the way that we're built, but it helps to have someone to talk to. And then when we come down to the inevitable event of death, I actually in the book, the first third of it was about the experience. And then I have 20 chapters of insights that I gained during that hospital stay, basic. So 20 different chapters, many of which tie into the concept or the theme of servanthood. But I have some other things that are also very important that aren't exactly tied to that theme. One of them is getting your house in order. And I started thinking, wow, if I die, I have 4 file cabinets, more than that. I have 4 drawers and a big file cabinet plus a smaller file cabinet full of stuff. And if my family has to go through all of that to decide what's expendable and important, that I hate to leave them with that. And so I recognized my house was not in order. And after I got through this, I went through the file cabinets, took a number of boxes of material to a professional shredder and had it shredded. And I had a friend, I got electronic stuff everywhere. I'm a techie guy. And I flew a guy in. I paid for his plane flight in and back, and he stayed with me, but I had him help me for about 3 days deal with all of my electronic stuff so that my family would not have to go through that and figure out what was important and what wasn't. And so I'm trying to keep my house in order more because I've seen so many families that were just had so many problems because their loved one who died wasn't prepared. His house wasn't in order. I've been to several at my age. I happen to attend a lot of memorial services, at least lately. One of them died at to me, a fairly young age. He was in his maybe mid 60s or early 60s. But his grown daughter, got up and did her own little short sermon. She said, when my dad died, he had his business in order. We knew exactly what to do. Everything was legally written out. We did not have to make one difficult decision. And she said it was such a hard time when he passed because it was sudden and unexpected. She said, we didn't have to figure anything out. He had it all outlined and we knew exactly what to do. And she says that was such a relief and a comfort.
Right.
And she said, you need to do that for your family. And so I have a chapter talking about that. And my wife and I have had a will for many years. We've redone it probably 4 or 5 times as circumstances have changed. I have instructions about my memorial service. I have instructions about my financial issues, who to contact, phone numbers, who to call first when I die. All of that's written out. All of that's been written out for a long time. So my house was already in better order than most, but I've tried to get people to write wills who won't do it. And yet we're all going to die. And so if there's anything I would love to do, it would be to convince people that the idea of aging and death is a part of the human process, and you need to accept it as a normal thing, even though it's scary, and you need to prepare. So I think it's a big lesson.
Yes, and it is part of living with eternity in mind as well, is what we want to
Exactly.
leave with our family and our loved one. And that with God, we can do all things. We can face that enemy and we can take
Right.
actions today to alleviate our family, our loved ones, so that they can grieve in peace and continue with faith.
By the way, let me
Yes.
throw one more thing in. I know that you have interviewed Jeannie Shaw for a
Yes.
podcast. She's a very dear friend of mine. But about 10 years ago,
Yes.
she got the idea of putting a book together called An Aging Grace. And she
Yes.
had different writers for it, and they talked about the whole process of aging and various things about it, everything from financial issues to sexual issues to she covered the gamut pretty well. So it's a great book that she put together. And I
Thank
wrote
you.
a chapter about aging, and then I wrote the final chapter about the inevitability of death. And I think I did it in a very positive way. And so that's a good book to help people because there are many things about aging that
Mm.
are unexpected
Yeah.
and unwanted, but we have to accept
All
that
of us,
it's
right?
part
Go
of
through
it.
it. Yes. I will put that book in the show note as well, the reference, so that it's a great one. And I believe that you wrote those articles before your cancer diagnosis
Oh, yeah, that was 10 years ago.
10 years
So
ago. Yeah.
it was
Would you have
actually,
said something differently, perhaps?
no, I've reread them. I thought they were pretty good,
Oh, nice.
but I feel like Jeannie prepared me
Yeah, to think
for,
about such thing before.
yeah,
Yeah.
since I
That's,
was one of the older writers in the book, I think it was helpful to me. I think God designed that.
mm,
And I called Jeannie up after I got the email about the assignments and said, Jeannie, you gave me the chapter on aging and death, the two hardest things for me. And she just laughed and she says, that's not really the intent, Gordon. It has a different title in that,
mm,
each of the
mm,
chapters. But I said, it gets down to that. And it did. But I tried to do it in a positive way,
mhm.
as I believe God would have us look at it.
Absolutely. So we are concluding here our interview. Is there one final word of encouragement that you'd like to share with our listeners before we?
Number one, get on Amazon and look up the title of that book and buy
Yes.
it. You can get it on the Kindle version or in the paperback version. And I would love to see the book read more because there are many principles that I cover in those 20 chapters, the last 2/3 of the book. There are many principles I cover, as well as a whole ordeal of how do you just even face cancer when you're diagnosed. But the chapters have some great content in them. I feel like it's one of the best books I've ever written,
Mm,
and yet it's the least sold, as I
mm,
said, by far of any of the 21 books that I've written.
mm.
So I
So
had
read the
no
book.
idea it would be so difficult to get
Yeah.
people to read it, but it gives you many life lessons. It's
Mhm.
not all about death and dying, trust me.
Mm,
It's about living and how to live and how to view God and how to view yourself and how to view you and God in relationship and
mm,
what a personal relationship with God is all about. How can we see
mhm.
God? How can we communicate with God? It has so many spiritual lessons in it,
Yeah.
aside from the issue of disease and death.
Right.
And so I would definitely encourage people to buy it and read it.
Right.
Everyone that's contacted me after reading it was really happy that they read it.
For sure. And we have the spirit of power, not of timidity. We can face and go there with God and see
Right,
what renewed relationship we can have with Him, a deeper one, for
right.
sure. Thank you so much, Gordon. Your wisdom, your vulnerability, your eternal perspective are such a gift to us. I thank you so much again. And I will put all the links in the show notes for the books and Jeannie Shaw's book as well. And I wish you the best. And I wish you good health for a long time.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's great being back on your podcast. You're doing a great work. Keep it up.
Thank
Uh,
you.
your spirit communicates encouragement.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge this was a bit of a roller coaster. We covered a lot of deep, meaningful ground, and it stirred me emotionally, spiritually, and practically. I hope it did the same for you and that you walked away with something meaningful. Here are a few key takeaways I personally cherished from this conversation. God is always at work. As Gordon said, I've lost my faith in coincidences. Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. All things. Number 2, real leadership looks like servanthood. Mark 10 verses 44 through 45 says, whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Number 3, God did not become a servant when he became a man. He became a man because he is a servant. Just like he is Lord of Lords, he is servant of servants. Philippians 2 verses 7 through 8 says he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Number 4, gratitude is a safeguard. When we lose it, we open the door to temptation, to bitterness, and discouragement. Romans 1 shows that ingratitude marked the beginning of spiritual decline. Number 5, God desires heart transformation, not just outward obedience. Ezekiel 36 verse 26 says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. And finally, prepare. God reminded us that preparing for death is one of the most loving, practical things we can do, not out of fear, but out of love and trust. Philippians 1 verse 24 says, it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Because Paul knew that to remain would mean to serve and help more people. He was always thinking of others, just like Jesus. So yes, death is an enemy, but in Christ, we are no longer slaves to its fear. Hebrews 2 verses 14 through 15 reminds us, so that by his death, he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So avoiding it is another way to expressing fear of death. And the dying to self that Jesus invites us into doesn't have to wait for the end of life either. It can start today. It can be your life philosophy. It is a very countercultural way to live. And what does that mean practically? It means letting go of self and asking instead, God, what is on your heart today? How do you want me to participate in your plans? Or God, what need do you want to meet through me today? These powerful questions were emailed to me by the incredible Caine, and I encourage you to ask them regularly. You will be amazed at how God answers and how peaceful and purposeful your life will become when you daily choose to die to self and walk with Him. John 10 verse 10 says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Amen. So thank you so much for listening, and congratulations if you've made it to the end of this episode. You've journeyed through one of the most important and challenging and often avoided conversations in life, how to face death with faith and live with purpose. If you'd like to go deeper and receive encouragement, resources, and behind the scenes updates, I'd love for you to become an insider. So join the newsletter at curiousforchrist.kit.com/insider. With peace and love, see you next time on Curious for Christ. Hi, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, would you like to take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who may also struggle with knowing God and His purpose for their life? Also, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let me know what topics you'd like to hear about in the future. Your voice matters. I'll meet you back next Friday for another episode.